Airlys had never expected to see the Alpha of Greymark on his knees. Certainly not in front of her. Certainly not with his hands bound in silver chains and his war-scarred face turned upward, like she was the only thing left in the world worth looking at. But here he was, kneeling at the foot of her throne while 5,000 wolves watched in silence. The man who had once torn her apart in front of everyone she had ever known was staring at her like she held his next heartbeat in her hands. And she did. The great hall of Thornvale stretched around them, vast and torchlit, carved from the bones of a mountain that had belonged to no one before Airlys claimed it. Banners bearing the silver crescent of the moon court hung from the rafters, catching the firelight so they seemed to glow. Behind her stood her council. Before her knelt a king without a crown, dragged across 3 territories to answer for what he had done. Aldrich did not look like she remembered him. The arrogance was gone. The broad shoulders that had once filled every doorway like a wall of muscles and authority were bowed forward under the weight of the chains. His dark hair hung loose, unwashed, falling across a face that had grown gaunt in the months since she had last seen it. There were shadows beneath his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. His breathing was ragged, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out ruined. Airlys, he said. Just her name, nothing else. No title, no demand, no explanation. Just her name spoken like it was the only word he had left. She did not answer, not because she had nothing to say, but because the sound of her name in his mouth still did something terrible to the space behind her ribs, and she hated him for that. She hated that it still mattered. She gripped the arm of the throne until her knuckles went white, and she kept her face perfectly still. The crowd was restless. She could feel it without looking, the shifting weight of 5,000 bodies, the held breath, the hunger for justice or vengeance or both. Some of these wolves had followed her from the beginning, had watched her build Thornvale from bare earth and sheer will. Others had come later, drawn by the pull of her authority, and they did not know the full story. They only knew that the Alpha of Greymark had wronged their queen, and they wanted him to pay. "You are aware of the charges," said Thesson, her commander, stepping forward from behind the throne. His voice was cold and formal and loud enough to carry across the hall. "The Alpha of the Greymark Pack stands accused of the public violation of a sacred mate bond, of stripping a bonded wolf of her rank, her name, and her place among her people, of banishment without grounds, of cruelty in the presence of the old gods." The words echoed through the stone chamber and then died. 5,000 wolves did not breathe. Airlys watched Aldrich's face for something, a flinch, a flash of defiance, the cold mask he used to wear when he ruled. She found none of it. She found something worse. He looked at her like he deserved every word. Like he had been waiting for this moment not with dread, but with something closer to relief. "How does the accused respond?" Thesson asked. Aldrich's jaw worked. His bound hands trembled at his sides. He lifted his head and his eyes found hers across the distance. Storm-colored eyes she had once believed held the whole sky in them. Eyes she had loved before she understood what love would cost her. "Guilty," he said, his voice cracked on the word, "to all of it." The silence that followed was so complete that Airlys could hear the torches spitting. She could hear her own pulse hammering in her throat. She could hear the soft intake of breath from 5,000 witnesses who had expected a fight and received a surrender. A murmur began at the edges of the hall and spread inward. Some wolves shifted in their seats. Others leaned forward, waiting for the sentence, waiting for Airlys to deliver the blow that would finish what she had started when she rose from the ashes of her exile and built a kingdom from nothing. Airlys rose from the throne. The movement was slow, deliberate, and every eye in the hall tracked her as she descended the 3 stone steps and crossed the distance between them. Her gown trailed behind her on the stone floor, silver thread catching the torchlight. The crown she wore was not gold or jewels, but woven moonstone, pale and luminous, and it cast faint light across her face as she moved. She stopped 2 paces from where he knelt, close enough to see the pulse jumping in his throat. close enough to smell the pine and iron scent of him that had haunted her through every sleepless night since the exile, close enough to see the way his hands shook inside the chains and the way he made no effort to hide it. He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet. "You destroyed me," she said. The words came out quieter than she had intended, meant for him alone. But the hall was so silent that they carried anyway. "You tore me apart in front of the entire pack, called me worthless, and threw me to the wilds like I was nothing." His throat worked. A single tear escaped and tracked down his face, catching the torchlight as it fell. "I know," he whispered, "and I would give anything to undo it." Airlie stared down at him. And the thing inside her, that she had spent months trying to kill, stirred and ached and refused to die. Her wolf pressed against the inside of her skin, reaching toward him with a longing so fierce it made her jaw clench. She wanted to hate him. She had earned the right to hate him. But the bond did not care about rights or earned things. It only knew that he was here, and he was hers, and he was broken. But that was now. 3 months ago, Airlise did not have a throne. She did not have an army or a mountain or a name that made alphas flinch. 3 months ago, she was no one, and this is how she became everything. The morning of the bonding ceremony, Airlise woke before dawn and told herself today would be the day her life began. She was wrong, of course. Today would be the day her life ended. But she did not know that yet, so she braided her hair with careful fingers and tried to steady the wild, fluttering hope inside her. The Greymark pack occupied a sprawling territory in the Veldorn lowlands, dense forest and cold rivers, and a central village built around the Great Hall where all major decisions were made. Airlise had lived there her entire life, all 21 years of it, and in all that time, she had never once stood at the center of anything. She was an Omega, the lowest rank a wolf could carry and still belong. No family name, no bloodline of significance, no particular beauty or gift that elevated her above the dozens of other young women in the pack. She worked in the healing house under Mistress Helwyn, grinding herbs and stitching wounds and mixing poultices for injured scouts. It was quiet work, invisible work, the kind of work that kept the pack running without anyone ever noticing who was doing it. But Airlise had a secret, and it lived behind her ribs like a second heartbeat. She was bonded to the Alpha, not officially, not publicly. The bond had flickered to life 3 months earlier during the spring hunt, when Aldrich had carried a wounded scout into the healing house, and his hand had brushed against hers while she worked. The shock had traveled through her like lightning made of warmth, and she had looked up into his gray eyes and known with a certainty that went deeper than thought or reason. He was hers. She was his. The old magic had chosen them. She had said nothing. How could she? Omegas did not bond with alphas. It was unheard of, impossible. A joke the gods were playing on a girl foolish enough to believe. She had buried it, pushed it down into the quiet part of herself, where she kept all the things she was not allowed to want. But today was the bonding ceremony, the sacred ritual where the alpha chose his mate before the entire pack and the old gods alike. And despite everything she told herself, despite every rational thought in her head screaming that it was impossible, the bond behind her ribs burned with a hope she could not extinguish. The great hall was packed by mid-morning. Every wolf in the Greymark territory had come, over 300 of them, filling the stone chamber until the air was thick with body heat and anticipation. Airlise stood near the back wall beside Brielle, her only real friend, a sharp-tongued scout with a permanent scowl and a heart softer than she would ever admit. "Stop fidgeting," Brielle murmured. "You look like you are about to be sick." "I might be," Airlise whispered back. At the front of the hall, Aldrich stood on the raised stone platform beside the Elder Council. He was devastating in the formal leathers of the ceremony, his dark hair pushed back from a face that was all hard angles and restrained intensity. He stood the way he always stood, like the room was his and everyone in it existed because he allowed it. The raw authority of him was suffocating even from 40 paces away. Fenella stood to his left, tall, golden-haired, sharp-eyed Fenella, daughter of the pack's most powerful family and the obvious choice. Everyone knew it. The whispers had been circulating for weeks. Fenella was born for the position, bred for it, groomed for it since childhood. She stood with her chin lifted and her hands clasped before her, serene and expectant. Airlys looked at her and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The elder began the invocation, a long chant in the old tongue that echoed off the stone walls and seemed to vibrate in the floor beneath their feet. Airlys felt the bond flare. Hot and desperate, she pressed her hand against her ribs and tried to breathe. Aldrich's gaze swept the room. It was routine. A ceremonial glance meant to acknowledge the gathered pack before the choosing. His eyes moved over faces, over rows of wolves he had known his entire life, and then they landed on her. The effect was instantaneous. She felt it like a physical blow. A jolt that snapped through the bond and lit her up from the inside. His eyes widened, his body went rigid. She saw the recognition hit him, the shock and the knowing, and for one blazing, impossible second, the Alpha of Greymark looked at Airlys like she was the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask. The bond between them ignited. Every wolf in the room felt it. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. Heads turned, eyes searched. And 300 wolves followed their alpha's stunned gaze to the back of the hall, where a nobody Omega stood trembling against the wall. Fenella's serene expression cracked. The eld faltered in his chant. Silence crashed through the hall like a wave. Airlys could not move. She could not breathe. She stood pinned beneath Aldrich's gaze, while the bond between them blazed, so bright she was certain everyone in the room could see it. This was it. The old gods had spoken, the magic had chosen. Then Aldrich looked away. The bond inside her screamed. "I choose Fenella," he said. His voice was steady, controlled, and absolute. The words fell through the silence like stones dropped into deep water. Airlys felt her knees buckle. Brielle's hand shot out and gripped her arm, the only thing keeping her upright. But Aldrich was not finished. He turned back to face the hall, and his gaze found Airlys again, and this time there was no warmth in it. This time his eyes were hard and cold and deliberate. "Let it be known," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, "that the bond I was offered is refused. A wolf of no name, no rank, and no blood has no place beside an alpha. The old magic is mistaken." A murmur swept through the crowd. Shock, disbelief. No one refused a sacred bond. It was not done. It was blasphemy. "Furthermore," Aldrich said, and each word hit Airlys like a fist, "let this wolf be removed from the territory by sundown. She is no longer Greymark." The hall erupted. Voices rose in confusion and outrage, some in protest, most in cruel agreement. But Iserlys heard none of it. She heard nothing but the roaring in her own ears and the splintling sound to something inside, her breaking into pieces so small she would never find them all. Brielle was pulling her toward the door. The crowd parted, not out of respect but out of revulsion, like she was contaminated. She caught glimpses of faces she recognized, people she had healed, fed, helped. None of them met her eyes. The last thing she saw before the doors closed behind her was Fenella's hand resting on Aldrich's arm and the cold, satisfied smile on her perfect golden face. The sunlight outside was blinding. Airlys stumbled down the steps and collapsed in the dirt. And the sound that came out of her was not a scream and not a sob, but something in between that tore itself from her throat like an animal trying to escape. Brielle knelt beside her, holding her shoulders, whispering things that did not reach her. Somewhere behind them, the doors to the great hall opened again, and a guard's voice carried across the yard. "You have until sundown. Take nothing that belongs to the pack." She owned nothing that belonged to the pack. She owned nothing at all. Airlys walked out of Greymark with the clothes on her back and a hole where the bond had been. She walked until the village was gone, and the forest swallowed the path, and the sounds of the only life she had ever known faded into silence. She walked until her legs gave out, and the ground rose up to meet her, and then she lay in the dirt, among the roots of an ancient oak, and let the grief take her. Above her, invisible behind the daylight, the moon was waiting. The forest grew darker the deeper she went, and Airlys did not care. She walked without direction, without thought, without anything except the dull ache that pulsed with every heartbeat like a wound that refused to close. Night came. She did not stop. The trees pressed closer, their trunks massive and gnarled and ancient, and the path beneath her feet disappeared entirely, replaced by moss and stone, and the tangled roots of things that had been growing since before the packs had names. She stumbled over rocks she could not see. Branches tore at her clothes and skin. She bled in small ways she did not bother to notice. Somewhere behind her, wolves howled. Gray-marked wolves running their evening patrol along the border. The border she had been cast beyond. The sound should have frightened her. Instead, it hollowed her out. She had been one of them that morning. Now their voices were just noise. She walked until she could not walk anymore. Her body simply stopped, her legs folding beneath her, at the edge of a creek so narrow she could have stepped across it. She sat in the mud with the water running cold against her ankles and stared at nothing. You could die out here, she told herself. And the thought arrived with surprising calm. You could just stay here and let it happen. The bond, or what remained of it, throbbed weakly inside her, the severed end of a rope still reaching toward something that had cut it loose. Even now, even after everything, her body was still reaching for him, still wanting, still hoping with a stubbornness that made her want to scream. She pressed her fist against her sternum and gritted her teeth. "Stop," she hissed at herself. "He does not want you." He was very clear. The words should have been a comfort. They should have killed the last ember of hope and let her begin the slow, so ugly work of letting go. Instead, they burned. The ember did not die. It grew. Something stirred inside her. Not the bond. Something deeper. Something older. Something she had never felt before. A sensation like heat rising from the base of her spine, climbing upward through her body like fire through a dry tree. Erlise gasped. Her hands flew to the ground for balance as the heat intensified, spreading through her limbs, her core, her skull. Her vision blurred. The creek, the trees, the darkness. All of it shimmered and warped like the world was being viewed through water. Her wolf surged forward, not the timid, quiet wolf that had lived beneath her skin since childhood, not the docile, gentle presence she had learned to ignore because omegas did not shift. Omegas did not fight. Omegas kept their wolves small and silent and out of the way. This was something else entirely. This wolf was enormous. She felt it rise inside her like a tide, filling spaces she did not know she had, pressing against the boundaries of her body with a force that was terrifying and exhilarating, and completely beyond her control. The pain came fast and blinding, and Airlie screamed as her bones began to break and reform. Shifting was not supposed to hurt like this. She had watched other wolves shift dozens of times, the fluid, graceful transformation from human to beast that took seconds and looked almost effortless. This was nothing like that. This was agony. Every bone in her body shattered and rebuilt itself. Every muscle tore and rewove. Every nerve ending ignited like a wire touched by lightning. She screamed again or tried to, but the sound that left her throat was no longer human. It was a howl, a long, raw, shattering sound that split the silence of the ancient forest and echoed off the mountains and carried for miles in every direction, and then it was over. Airlie stood on 4 legs in the shallow creek, panting, trembling, alive in a way she had never been before. The world was different. She could see everything, every leaf, every shadow, every insect moving in the moss. She could smell the earth and the water and the distant smoke of Greymark's fires miles behind her. She could hear the heartbeat of a deer 3 ridges away. She looked down at her reflection in the creek and froze. Her wolf was silver, not gray, not pale, not the muted tones that any natural wolf might carry. Silver, pure, luminous, impossible silver. And her fur seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, casting pale light across the surface of the water like moonlight made solid. This was not an Omega's wolf. Airlie stared at the creature in the water, and the creature stared back with eyes that burned like white fire. And she understood with a certainty that sank into her bones that she had never been what they told her she was. She ran, not away from anything, but toward the feeling of space opening up ahead of her. She ran through the ancient trees, her silver paws silent on the moss, her body moving with a speed and power she had never imagined possible. The forest blurred around her. The wind tore through her fur. The moon broke through the canopy overhead, and when its light touched her, she felt it in her blood like a second heartbeat. She ran until dawn turned the sky gray and her legs finally slowed, and she found herself standing on a ridge overlooking a valley she had never seen before. Vast and wild untouched, it stretched out below her in the early morning light. A sea of green forest threaded with silver rivers and bordered by mountains that reached into the clouds. It was empty, unclaimed, free. Airlise shifted back to human form and stood bare and shivering on the ridge, her human form exposed to the cold. Her body ached from the transformation, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. But the pain inside her was different now. The severed bond still throbbed, but beside it, around it, something new had taken root, something vast and steady and ancient. She heard footsteps behind her and spun, her heart slamming against her ribs. An old woman stood at the edge of the tree line. Leaning on a walking staff carved from bone, she was small and weathered and brown, with white hair cropped close to her skull and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the morning light. She wore the rough furs of a wolf who lived outside pack territory. "Been a long time since one of you showed up," the old woman said, looking Airlise up and down with the practiced calm of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Airlise covered herself with her arms, suddenly aware that she had nothing to cover herself with. "Who are you?" she managed. The old woman tossed her a bundle of cloth, a worn cloak. "Name's Ismarin. I have been waiting for you." She paused, studying Airlise with those bottomless dark eyes. "Or someone like you, at least." "A moon wolf." Airlise caught the cloak and wrapped it around herself with shaking hands. "A what?" Marin smiled. And there was something ancient and knowing in it, something that made the hair on the back of Airlise's neck stand up. "Come with me," the old woman said. "We have a great deal to discuss, and you are going to need to eat before any of it makes sense." She turned and disappeared into the trees. Airlise stood on the ridge, the valley spread below her, the wind cold against her skin, the impossible silver light still fading from her veins. Then she followed. Behind her, carried on the wind from the direction of Greymark, she heard wolves howling, but the sound was wrong somehow, frantic, panicked. Like something inside the pack had broken in the night and no one could find the missing piece. Airlise did not look back. Mervin's home was not a house. It was out space beneath the roots of a tree so ancient and so vast that its trunk was wider than the great hall of Greymarsh. The interior was warm and dry and smelled of dried sage and smoke, and every surface was covered with things. Bones etched with symbols Airlise did not recognize. Bundles of dried plants hanging from root beams overhead. Stacks of crumbling leather journals with handwriting too faded to read. Airlise sat on a stone ledge near the fire pit, wrapped in the borrowed cloak, eating dried venison so fast she nearly choked on it. Marin watched her with the patient expression of someone who had been waiting a very long time. "Slow down," the old woman said. "You will make yourself sick, and I would rather not spend the next hour holding your hair." Airlise swallowed hard and forced herself to take a breath. Her body was trembling with exhaustion, but beneath the fatigue, something hummed in her veins, a low, constant vibration, like the ringing of a bell that had not yet finished sounding. "You called me a moon wolf," Airlise said. "I do not know what that means." Marin settled into the chair across from her and steepled her fingers. "It means the world just changed, girl, whether it knows it yet or not." She paused, gathering her words. "Every pack in every territory operates on the same hierarchy. Alphas at the top, betas in the middle, omegas at the bottom. That has been the order of things for as long as anyone can remember. But the old records, the ones the elders do not teach anymore, because they would rather forget, tell a different story." She reached for one of the crumbling journals and opened it carefully, turning the brittle pages with practiced fingers. Before the packs organized, before the hierarchy calcified into what it is now, there was another rank, above Alpha, above everything. The moon wolves. Early stared at her. Above Alpha, she repeated. The words felt absurd in her mouth. Moon wolves were the ones who built the first territories, Marin continued. Not through conquest or bloodshed, but through a kind of authority that came from the moon itself. They could calm a feral wolf with their presence. They could heal land that had been poisoned. They could forge bonds between packs that had been at war for generations. Their power was not violence. It was gravity. Other wolves followed them because their very nature made it impossible not to. That sounds like a fairy tale, Early said, though her voice shook. It does, Marin agreed, which is exactly why the Alphas buried it. A rank above theirs threatened everything they had built. So the moon wolves were forgotten, written out of history, and the rare few who still manifested were identified young and suppressed. Told they were omegas, told their wolves were weak and quiet. She looked at Airlise over the top of the journal. Sound familiar? The air left Airlise's lungs. Every memory of her childhood rearranged itself in her mind, the way her wolf had always felt muzzled. The way she had been told to keep it quiet, keep it small, keep it hidden. She had believed she was broken, that her wolf was defective. They knew, she whispered. The elders, they knew what I was. Someone knew, Marin said, or suspected. And it was easier to bury you at the bottom of the pack than to deal with what you actually are. Airlise's hands clenched in her lap. The hum in her veins intensified, vibrating through her bones. So what am I supposed to do with this? Marin closed the journal and set it aside. That valley below us, she said, nodding toward the entrance. It is called Thornvale. It has been unclaimed for 300 years because the land itself rejects any alpha who tries to settle it. Scouts go mad within a week. Hunting parties lose their way and wander for days. The forest fights back. But, Airly started, but the land does not reject moonwolves. Marin finished. It was built for them. That valley was the seat of the last moon court 3 centuries ago, before the alphas dismantled it. The land has been waiting for someone like you ever since. Airlise rose on unsteady legs and moved to the entrance of the root dwelling. The valley spread above her in the morning light, impossibly green, impossibly vast, threaded with rivers that caught the sun like veins of silver. Something inside her responded to the sight, not the broken bond, but the new thing that had taken root beside it. A pull, a recognition. Like the land was looking back at her and saying, finally, I cannot rule a territory, Airlie said, though even as she spoke, the words felt hollow. I am a healer. I grind herbs and stitch wounds. Marin appeared beside her, leaning on her staff. You were a healer. You were also an Omega. You were also nobody. She paused. What are you now? Airlise did not answer. She stared at the valley and felt the silver light stirring in her blood. Over the following days they came, one by one, then in pairs, then in groups. Wolves who had been driven from their packs for being too weak or too strange or too inconvenient. Omegas cast out for refusing to submit, Betas punished for questioning their alphas. Families with young children who had fled territories where the strong fed on the obedience of the powerless. They came from every direction, drawn by something they could not name, something that pulled them toward Thornvale like a current beneath the earth. The first to arrive was a scarred young male named Thesson, who had been a warrior in the Blackmoor pack before their alpha had him beaten and exiled, for refusing to kill a surrendering prisoner. He walked into Marin's clearing with bruises still fresh on his knuckles and a look in his eyes that said he had run out of places to go. I felt something, Thesson said, standing rigid at the edge of the clearing like he expected to be turned away. A pull, coming from this direction. I have been walking for 2 days. Airlise looked at him, and her wolf stirred inside her. Not with aggression or fear, but with something she would later come to recognize as the moon wolf's gravity, the instinct to gather, to shelter, to draw in the lost and give them ground to stand on. You can stay, she said. The fence blinked, like he had not expected it to be that simple. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Erlise." "No," he said slowly, studying her face. "I mean, what are you? I have felt alpha commands before." "This is different. This is not dominance. It feels like," he searched for the word, "relief." More arrived. A woman named Corin, who could track anything across any terrain and had been expelled from the Ashenmere pack for bearing a child with a human. A pair of brothers, Lachlan and Orin, both blacksmiths, both too gentle for the war-hungry pack that had raised them. A girl of 14 named Sage, who had not spoken since the raid that killed her family, but whose eyes followed Erlise everywhere with quiet, desperate trust. By the end of the first week, there were 30 of them. By the end of the second, nearly 70. Erlise stood on the ridge one evening, watching the fires of the growing settlement flicker in the valley below, and felt the weight of what was happening settle onto her shoulders. These people had followed something they could not explain. Crossed hostile territory, risked everything, because some instinct told them to come here. "They are looking at you the way wolves look at a true leader," Marin said from behind her. "I do not know how to be a leader," Erlise admitted. "You do not have to know," Marin replied. "You just have to care enough to try. The rest, the Moonwolf handles." Erlise closed her eyes and felt the pale fire pulse through her, steady as a heartbeat. Connected to the valley and the rivers and the ancient trees and the 70 lost wolves who had chosen to trust a stranger, she opened her eyes. "Then we build," she said. Behind her, carried on the wind from across the border, there was no more howling from Greymark. The silence was worse. 2 months later, Thornvale was no longer a scattering of campfires in a wild valley. It was a settlement, a real one, with structures and purpose and a population that had swelled to nearly 400 wolves. Erlise had not planned for it. She had not drawn up blueprints or held grand strategy meetings or done any of the things she imagined a real leader would do. What she did was listen. Corin organized the scouts and established perimeter patrols before Erlise had even thought to ask. Lachlan and Oren built a forge and began producing tools and weapons with quiet, relentless efficiency. Thesson, who turned out to have a terrifying for command romancist, structured a training program for the wolves who wanted to learn to fight, and a separate program for those who wanted to learn to grow food, and Erlise healed. That was what she knew, what her hands remembered. And it turned out that a moon wolf's healing was not the same as an omega's. When she set her hands on a wound, the silver light in her veins responded. Cuts closed faster. Fevers broke within hours. A young wolf who had arrived, yet dead from infection, was walking within 3 days. Word spread. It traveled through the borderlands and the exile roads and the whisper networks that connected the lost to one another. A silver wolf in the unclaimed valley, a place where outcasts were welcomed. A territory where the land itself seemed to thrive beneath its new keeper. The crops grew faster in Thornvale than anyone could explain. The rivers ran clearer. The game was abundant in a way that defied the season. Marin said the land was responding to the Moonwolf's presence, waking up after 3 centuries of dormancy. "You are feeding it," Marin explained one afternoon while Erlise worked in the newly built healing hall. "And it is feeding you. The bond between a moonwolf and her territory is symbiotic. The stronger you grow, the stronger the land grows. The healthier the land, the healthier your people." "My people," Erlise repeated, and the words still felt strange in her mouth. Strange and fragile and enormous, but they were hers. She felt them through the connection that the moonwolf sustained, felt them the way she imagined a mother felt the heartbeat of a child. 400 lives humming at the edge of her awareness, and the number grew every week. Not everything was easy. Disputes arose between wolves from different packs who carried old grudges. Resources stretched thin as the population grew. A territorial skirmish erupted along the eastern border when scouts from the Blackmore pack tested their boundaries. Thesson handled it without bloodshed, but with enough force that the message was clear. "We need formal borders," Thesson told her after the incident, his expression grim. "And we need the other packs to recognize them. Right now, We are an unrecognized settlement on unclaimed land. That makes us a target. We are not a settlement, Airlie said. And the words came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. We are a territory, and they will recognize us. They will not have a choice. Thesson studied her face, and whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. Then we need a name for what this is. Thornvale, Airlie said. It already has a name. I mean what you are, Thesson corrected. Not a pack. Packs are led by alphas. This is something else. Airlise looked at him, and the pale glow flickered in her eyes. Then call it a court. The Moon Court. The name spread through the settlement by nightfall. By morning it had crossed the border. Meanwhile, Greymark was rotting. Airlise did not know this yet, but she would learn it soon enough. The signs had begun the night she left, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The hunting grounds dried up within a week of her exile. Game that had been plentiful for decades vanished from the forests, like it had been summoned. Away, the river that fed the village turned brackish. Livestock grew thin and listless. Crops that should have thrived in the summer heat withered and died before they could be harvested. The healers had no explanation. The elders searched the old records and found nothing. And at the center of it all, unsleeping and unraveling, the Alpha of Greymark was coming apart at the seams. Aldrich told no one about the bond. He could not afford to. Admitting that the sacred mate bond he had publicly rejected was still alive inside him, still burning, still pulling him toward the Omega he had cast out, would have destroyed the last shred of authority he had left. So he buried it. He buried it the way Airlise had buried her wolf for 21 years, with gritted teeth and shaking hands and a silence so ferocious it ate him. Alive, but the bond did not care about his silence. It punished him for the severance. He could not sleep. Food tasted like ash. His wolf, once powerful and sure, became erratic and aggressive, snarling at his own beta, snapping at advisors who spoke too slowly. Fenella, his chosen mate, watched his deterioration with growing unease. The bonding ceremony between them had not taken. The old magic refused to seal what Aldrich had forced. And every night Fenella lay beside a man whose wolf howled for someone else. The whispers reached him on a Tuesday. A scout returned from the eastern border with a report that should have been routine, but that turned Aldrich's blood to ice. There is a settlement in Thornvale, the scout said. Several hundred wolves. They are calling it a court. Aldrich's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. Thornvale is unclaimed. No alpha can hold that territory. The scout hesitated. It is not led by an alpha, sir. They say it is led by a silver wolf, a female. They are calling her the Moon Wolf. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the fire to pop twice. Aldrich stared at the scout with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief, to something the scout would later describe to his companions as the look of a man watching his own house burn down. Describe her, Aldrich said, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. The scout swallowed. Silver fur, white eyes when she shifts young. They say she heals wounds with her hands. They say the land grows where she walks. Aldrich closed his eyes. The bond inside him, the one he had spent 2 months trying to suffocate, roared to life with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. He gripped the chair until the wood groaned beneath his fingers. Sir, the scout asked cautiously, do you know who she is? Aldrich did not answer. He could not answer, because the Omega he had humiliated, the nobody he had cast into the wilds to die, had not died. She had become something he could not even name. And she had built a kingdom in the place he could never reach. Fenella appeared in the doorway behind the scout, and her sharp blue eyes read every emotion on Aldrich's face before he could hide them. It is her, Fenella said flatly. Is it not? It was not a question. The envoy arrived at dawn. 3 wolves in formal Greymark colors approached the eastern gate of Thornvale carrying a white banner and the unmistakable air of men who would rather be anywhere else. Thesson intercepted them at the perimeter and brought them to the great clearing at the center of the settlement where Airlise was already waiting. She had known they were coming, not through scouts or warnings, but through the land itself, a low vibration in the ground that told her foreign wolves had crossed into her territory. The moon wolf's awareness was growing stronger with each passing week, weaving itself into the rivers and the roots and the stone beneath her feet, until Thornvale felt less like a place she lived and more like an extension of her own body. The envoys knelt. They carried a sealed letter bearing Aldrich's crest. Airlise did not open it. She held the heavy paper in her hands and felt the faintest residual warmth of him in the wax. And the severed bond ached so sharply she had to clench her jaw to keep her face still. "Speak," she said. "Tell me what this says." The lead envoy, a lean, gray-haired male named Heron, cleared his throat. The Alpha of Greymark requests a formal audience with the leader of the Thornvale. Settlement. A diplomatic meeting to discuss borders, trade, and the possibility of an alliance. An alliance, Thesson repeated from behind Airlise, his voice flat with disbelief. Airlise turned the letter over in her hands. "He banished me from his territory 3 months ago," she said quietly. "Stripped me of my name in front of 300 wolves and told me I was nothing. And now he wants an alliance." The envoy's discomfort was visible. "I was instructed to convey the Alpha's message, not to interpret it." "Then convey this in return," Airlise said, raising her chin. "The Moon Court does not recognize the authority of the Greymark Alpha to request anything. If he wishes to speak with me, he will come himself. He will come without weapons and without guards, and he will come to my hall, not his." The envoys exchanged uneasy glances. "With respect." "The Alpha will not agree to those terms." "Then we have nothing to discuss," Airlisis replied. She turned and walked away. And she made it all the way back to the healing hall before her legs gave out, and she had to grip the edge of the workbench to keep from sliding to the floor. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came in ragged bursts that she could not control. Marin appeared beside her with the quiet inevitability of someone who always knew when she was needed. "Steady, child. I am fine." Airlise managed through gritted teeth. "You are shaking so hard the jars are rattling," Marin observed. "That is not fine by any standard." "He wants to talk," Airlise said, and the bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "After everything he did, he wants to talk. Like I should be grateful. Like 3 months of building something from nothing should be wiped away because the great Alpha is finally willing to acknowledge I exist." Marin was quiet for a moment. "What did you feel when you held the letter?" Airlise closed her eyes. "Him," she admitted. "I felt him. The bond is still there, Marin. It never died. It just got quiet." "Bonds do not die when they are rejected," Marin said. "They fester." "For both wolves." "Good," Airlise said viciously. "Let him fester." But she did not mean it, and Marin's silence said she knew. Aldrich came. He came alone, without weapons, without guards, without the armor of rank and ceremony that had defined every interaction she had ever witnessed him have. He walked through the eastern gate of Thornvale on foot in a plain traveling coat with his hands visible and empty. And the wolves of the Moon Court lined the path and watched him pass, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Airlise received him in the clearing, not inside the hall. She wanted witnesses. She wanted every wolf in Thornvale to see the Alpha of Greymarks standing in her territory, on her terms, asking for her time. He was thinner than she remembered. The powerful frame that had once made her feel small was diminished, his cheeks hollowed, his eyes sunken. He moved like a man carrying something too heavy to set down, and when he finally stood before her, close enough that the bond between them flared with a heat that made her vision blur, she saw that his hands were trembling. "Airlise," he said, her name in his mouth. Again. The way it had sounded on the night of the ceremony when he chose someone else. The way it would sound months from now in a torchlit hall when he knelt before her in chains. Her name had become a wound he kept reopening. "Alpha Aldrich," she replied, and the formality was deliberate. A wall built from words. He flinched. She saw it clearly. The tiny contraction of muscle around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened. He had expected her to be angry, certainly, but the coldness, the distance, the way she looked at him like he was a stranger, that was something he had not prepared for. "What happened to Greymark?" Airlise continued. her voice steady, "is not my concern. You made your choice. I am making mine." "The territory is dying," Aldrich said, and the words came out rough, stripped of all pretense. "The land, the water, the game. Everything is failing. Our healers say it began the night you left." "The night you threw me out," Airlis corrected softly. He absorbed the correction like a blow. "Yes," he said, "the night I threw you out." Silence stretched between them. 400 wolves watched from the edges of the clearing, barely breathing. "Why did you do it?" Airlis asked. And the question surprised her, because she had not planned to ask it. Not here, not now, not in front of everyone. But the words escaped before she could catch them, and they carried more pain than she wanted to show. Aldrich's composure cracked. She watched it happen, watched the careful mask he wore splinter and fall away, leaving behind a face so raw with anguish it made her stomach drop. "Because I was afraid," he said. "The bond hit me like a lightning strike. I felt it the moment I touched your hand in the healing house. And it terrified me." He paused, his voice roughening. "You were an Omega. I was the Alpha. The elders told me a bond with an Omega would weaken the pack, that the other territories would see it as a vulnerability and attack. Fenella's family controlled half our resources. Rejecting her would have fractured Greymark from the inside. So you fractured me instead," Airlie said. The words landed like a blade. Aldrich's face twisted, and for a terrible moment she thought he might break down entirely. He caught himself with visible effort, his throat working, his gaze glistening. "I thought you would survive it," he said. "I thought the bond was new enough that it would fade. I thought I could live with the choice if I knew you were alive somewhere." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I did not know what you were. I did not know what I was destroying. You did not know I was a moon wolf," Eerly said. "I did not know you were everything," Aldrich replied, and the words broke open in the air between them. Honest and devastating and impossible to take back. Eerly's felt the bond surge inside her, hot and bright and agonizing. Her wolf pressed forward, desperate, longing, reaching for the other half of itself across the distance between them. She could feel his wolf doing the same, could feel it through the bond, the frantic, mournful howling of an animal that had been starving for months. She wanted to close the distance. She wanted to touch him, to let the bond do what bonds were designed to do. She wanted it so badly her entire body ached with the wanting. But she looked behind her, at the clearing and the settlement, and the 400 wolves who had followed her, because she was something more than what one man had decided she was worth. And she looked at him, at the man who had held her fate in his hands and thrown it away because it was politically inconvenient. "You chose fear," Eerly said, and her voice did not waver. "You chose power and politics, and the opinion of men who would have let me die in the forest without a second thought. And now you come here because the consequences are catching up to you, and you need me to fix it." "That is not why I came," Aldrich said. "Then why?" Eerly's demanded. He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes, and she saw something in them she had never seen before. Not the arrogance of an alpha, or the calculation of a leader, or the cold mask of a man protecting himself from vulnerability. She saw surrender. "Because I cannot breathe without you," he said, "and I deserve to suffer for what I did. But I needed you to know that it was never because you were nothing. You were the most terrifying thing that ever happened to me, and I ran." The silence that followed was absolute. Airlie stared at him, and the war inside her raged with a fury that threatened to tear her apart. The bond screamed for her to reach for him. The wolf howled for its mate, and the woman who had been shattered and rebuilt and crowned by her own suffering, stood perfectly still and held her ground. "You should go," she said. Aldrich's face crumpled. Just for a second. Just long enough for her to see it before he caught himself and straightened and swallowed down whatever sound had been trying to escape. "If that is what you want," he said, his voice barely holding together, "what I want has never been the issue." Airlis replied, "Go home, Aldrich. Fix your own territory. I have a kingdom to run." She turned her back on him, the hardest thing she had ever done. Harder than the exile, harder than the first shift, harder than any of it. She walked away from the only man the old gods had ever intended for her, and every step felt like tearing herself in half. Behind her, she heard him leave. She did not look back that night. Alone in her chambers at the top of the hall, Airlise pressed her face into her pillow and wept until there was nothing left. 3 days after Aldrich left Thornvale, Brielle arrived. Airlise was in the healing hall when the commotion started. Raised voices at the eastern gate, Thessen's sharp command cutting through the noise, and then a familiar voice that made Airlise's heart seize. "Get your hands off me. I am not a threat. I am barely 5 feet tall. Tell Airlise I am here, or I swear on every old god I will bite someone." Airlise was running before she finished processing the words. She burst through the doors of the healing hall and nearly collided with Thessen, who was escorting a filthy, exhausted, furious young woman into the clearing. Brielle, Airlise breathed. Her friend looked terrible. Her clothes were torn and muddy. Her hair was matted with leaves and what might have been dried blood. She had a bruise blooming across her left cheekbone that was at least a day old, and she was shaking with the specific kind of tremor that came from running too far on too little food. But her eyes were fierce and bright and absolutely furious. "You are alive," Brielle said, and then she burst into tears. They held each other in the middle of the clearing while 400 wolves pretended not to watch. Brielle sobbed into Airlise's shoulder with the abandon of someone who had been holding it together for too long, and Airlise held her and stroked her matted hair and whispered, "I am here, I am here, I am here." Later, cleaned up and fed and wrapped in a warm cloak by the fire in Airlise's chambers, Brielle told her everything. "Greymark is falling apart," she said, her voice hoarse. "The territory is dying, Airlise. The river is almost dry. Half the livestock are dead. The hunting parties come back empty-handed every time, and the pack is starving. Aldrich has been trying to hold it together, but he is barely functioning. He does not sleep. He barely eats. His wolf is turning feral, and the elders are talking about replacing him." "That is not my problem," Airlise said, though the words tasted like a lie. "There is more," Brielle said, and her expression shifted into something harder, something angry. "After you left, I started asking questions about what happened at the ceremony, about the bond, about why Aldrich rejected you, and nobody would answer me. The elders shut me down every time, told me to drop it, told me it was settled and done." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "So I broke into the elder vault, the locked archives beneath the great hall where they keep the old records." Airlise went still. "What did you find?" Brielle reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled out a sheaf of papers, creased and stained from the journey. She spread them on the table between them, and Airlise looked down at handwriting she recognized. "Elder Cyrus, the head of the Greymarch Council." They knew, Airlise. They knew what you were from the day you were born. The papers were meticulous. Detailed notes spanning 21 years, documenting the suppression of a female wolf cub who displayed what the elder called anomalous lunar signatures in her first shift assessment at age 3. The notes described a deliberate, sustained effort to muzzle her wolf through a combination of herbal compounds secretly mixed into her, food designed to keep her wolf dormant, and psychological conditioning designed to make her believe she was an omega. Airlise read the words, and her hands began to shake. "They poisoned my wolf," she whispered. "For 21 years. It gets worse," Brielle said, her jaw tight. "The order came from Fennell's family, her grandfather specifically. He was the one who identified you as a moon wolf when you were an infant. And he was the one who convinced the elders that a moon wolf would destabilize the pack hierarchy and had to be suppressed. He arranged for you to be classified as an omega. He arranged for the suppression. He arranged all of it." The silver light in Airlise's veins flared so hot it was almost painful. The table beneath her hands trembled. Across the room, jars rattled on their shelves. "And Aldrich?" Airlise asked, forcing the words through a throat that had gone tight. "Did he know?" "No," Brielle said firmly. "He did not, I am sure of it. The elders kept it from him deliberately. If the alpha knew his true mate was a moon wolf, he would never have agreed to the rejection. The elders manipulated the situation to ensure Fenella's family maintained their grip on the pack. Aldrich thought he was protecting Greymark from a politically dangerous bond with an Omega. He did not know you were the most powerful wolf born in 3 centuries. Irlise pressed her palms flat against the table and breathed. The power pulsed through her, wild and furious, and she felt the entire Vals respond. Outside, a wind rose from nowhere. The trees groaned. The river surged. Marin appeared in the doorway, her dark eyes sharp. Whatever you are feeling right now, child, rein it in before you shake the mountain loose. Irlise closed her eyes. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and slowly, painfully, she pulled the light back inside herself. "They stole my life," she said, and her voice was quiet and terrible. "They took my wolf, and they kept it caged with poison, and they told me I was nothing, and when the bond finally broke through anyway, they made sure the man I was bonded to would throw me away." "Yes," Marin said simply, "and now you have a choice." Irlise opened her eyes. "Greymark is dying because the land is tied to you," Marin continued. "You were born there. Your moonwolf's roots are in that soil. When you were exiled, the land began to die because the wolf it belonged to was gone. You have planted new roots here in Thornville, and this valley is thriving, but Greymarsh will keep withering until there is nothing left. Let it die," Irlise said, and the fury behind the words was white-hot. "You could," Marin agreed, "and no one would blame you, but 400 wolves still live there. Families with children, healers, hunters, the young and the old, and the ones who had no say in what was done to you. Their land is dying because of choices made by a handful of powerful men." Erlise's jaw clenched. "That is not fair." "No," Marin said, "it is not." The room fell silent. Brielle watched Erlise with anxious eyes. Marin waited with the patience of stone. "I do not want to save the people who destroyed me," Erlise whispered. "Then do not save them for their sake," Marin replied. "Save them for yours. Rage is a fire, child. It will keep you warm, but if you feed it long enough, it will consume the house." Before Erlise could respond, the door burst open. Thesson stood in the entrance, breathing hard, his face tight with alarm. "Riders from the east," he said. "A warband from the Blackmore pack. Over 1,000 wolves. They crossed into Greymark's territory at dawn." Irlise's blood went cold. "Why?" "Because Greymark is weak," Thesson said grimly. "And the Blackmore Alpha has been waiting for exactly this moment. If Greymark falls, Blackmore will control the entire lowland corridor." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "And their next target will be us." The weight of it crashed over her like a wave. Greymark's destruction was no longer theoretical. It was happening now, and if it fell, Thornvale would be next. The Blackmore Alpha would not tolerate a rival kingdom on his expanded border, especially one led by a wolf whose very existence challenged the hierarchy he ruled by. "How long before they reach the Greymark village?" Erlise asked. 2 days, Thesson replied. "Maybe less." Erlise looked at Brielle, looked at Marin, looked at her own hands, still trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go. "Prepare the fighters," she said. "Every wolf who can run, we march at dawn." Thesson's eyes widened. "You want to defend Greymark?" "I want to defend the wolves in Greymark who never had a choice," Erlise corrected. "The elders in Fenella's family can answer for what they did after, but no one else dies because of this." Thesson nodded once, sharp and decisive, and disappeared through the door. Brielle stared at Erlise with something between admiration and disbelief. Marin simply smiled. "Small and knowing and ancient. There she is," the old woman murmured. "The moon wolf." They ran through the night. 300 wolves in silver formation, pouring through the dark forest like a river of moonlight. Erlise led them in her shifted form, the great silver wolf that cast its own pale glow across the forest floor. She ran faster than she had ever run before, the land opening up beneath her paws like it was clearing a path. Thesson flanked her left, Corin flanked her right. Behind them, 300 wolves who had been outcasts and exiles and nobodies ran with the fierce, unified purpose of people who finally had something worth protecting. They reached the Greymark border by midnight. The scent hit Erlise first. Smoke and ash and the acrid tang of fear. She crested the ridge overlooking the lowlands and saw the fires. Blackmore had arrived early. The village was surrounded. Over 1,000 Blackmore wolves had encircled the settlement in a loose ring of torchlight and aggression. And at the center of the ring, Greymark's mate's remaining fighters had formed a desperate defensive line around the great hall. She could see them from the ridge, maybe 200 wolves, outnumbered 5 to 1, holding a perimeter that was already buckling. And at the front of that line, unmistakable even at this distance, stood Aldrich. He fought like a man who had already decided he was going to die. His wolf was enormous and dark, and it moved through the Blackmore line with a savagery that spoke not of strategy but of desperation. He was wounded. She could see the wounds marking his fur, could feel the pain of it through the bond like an echo in her own body. "There are too many," Thesson said. Shifted back to human form beside her. "Even with our numbers, we are still outmatched." "Not for long," Airlie said. She closed her eyes and reached for the silver light. Not the trickle she had been drawing on for months, the gentle warmth she used for healing and growing and sustaining. She reached for all of it, the full vast, ancient reservoir of power that lived in her blood and her bones and the roots of the mountain behind her and the rivers beneath the earth and the moon hanging enormous and white above them all. It answered. The light erupted from her like a shock wave. It rolled down the hillside in a visible wave, silver and blinding, and when it washed over the Blackmore wolves, they staggered, not from pain, but from weight, from the crushing, irresistible authority of a wolf who outranked every alpha on the field by an order of magnitude that had no name. The moon wolf's gravity, the force that made other wolves follow. The power that the alphas had buried 3 centuries ago because it made their authority obsolete. Every Blackmore wolf on the field felt it in their bones. The compulsion to kneel, to yield, to bare their throats to the radiance pouring down the hillside. Some of them did. Dozens dropped to the ground before they understood what was happening. Their wolves responding to an authority so primal and so absolute that conscious resistance was almost impossible. The Blackmore Alpha, a massive, scarred brute named Gavrin, snarled against the compulsion and held his ground. Around him, his strongest fighters shook off the effect and reformed their lines. But the damage was done. Nearly a third of his force had dropped, and the confusion that rippled through the remaining wolves was visible even from the ridge. Now, Airlie said. 300 Thornvale wolves poured down the hillside into the gap. The battle shifted in an instant. Thesson's fighters hit the Blackmore flank with a precision that spoke to months of training. Driving a wedge between Gavrin's main force and the wolf's still recovering from the moon wolf's compulsion, Airlie's did not hang back. She plunged into the chaos, and everywhere she went, the pale radiance followed. When she passed the Greymark defenders, their wounds began to close. Their exhaustion lifted. Their wolves surged with borrowed strength, fed by the moon wolf's presence like dry earth drinking rain. She fought her way toward Aldrich, not because she had planned to, but because the bond demanded it with a force that overrode every rational thought. In her head, she tore through the line separating them and found him cornered by 3 Blackmore fighters. His dark wolf limping from a dozen injuries, still snarling, still fighting, still refusing to fall. She hit the nearest Blackmore wolf from the side and sent him tumbling. The other 2 turned on her, and she met them with the full force of the moon wolf's authority. The compulsion hit them at point-blank range, and they went down instantly. Their wolves submitting before their human minds could even process what had happened. Aldrich's wolf staggered. Airlie shifted to human form and caught him as he fell, easing his massive frame to the ground. He shifted beneath her hands. And then it was the man she held, battered and broken, and staring up at her with an expression of bewildered wonder. "You came," he breathed. "Do not read into it," Airlie replied, her hands already glowing with healing light as she pressed them against the worst of his wounds. "Blackmore threatened my territory. This is strategic," he laughed, a raw, broken sound. and then winced as the healing light knit a gash across his ribs. "You are a terrible liar, and you are hurt everywhere." Hold still around them. The battle was turning. Gavrin's force crumbled as Theson's fighters and the Greymark's defenders pressed from both sides. The Blackmoor Alpha himself was brought down by Corin and 3 of her scouts, pinned and snarling in the mud, while the remains of his war band scattered into the forest. By the time dawn broke, it was over. The Blackmoor wolves had retreated or surrendered. Greymark's village was battered but standing, and in the middle of the field, surrounded by the aftermath of violence and the first pale light of morning, Airlise knelt beside the man who had destroyed her and healed his wounds one by one. Aldrich watched her work in silence. When the last cut had closed, she sat back on her heels, exhausted, her reserves nearly spent. "The elders," she said quietly. "Fenella's family. They knew what I was. They suppressed my wolf from birth." Aldrich's face went white. "What? You did not know," Airlise confirmed. "They kept it from you deliberately. They engineered the entire situation to ensure Fenella's family kept their position." She watched the realization hit him, watched the horror and the fury and the guilt cascade across his face in waves of, and she felt every one of them through the bond. "I rejected my trine true, because men I trusted told me it was the right thing to do," he said, his voice hollow. "And they were lying, yes." Airlie said. "I could have fought harder," he continued. "Even believing you were an Omega, I felt the bond. I knew what it meant. And I chose politics over you." "Yes," Airlie said again. He looked at her, and his gaze was stripped bare of every defense. "How do you forgive something like that?" Airlie's thought of Marin's words. "Rage is a fire. It will keep you warm, but if you feed it long enough, it will consume the house." She thought of the months she had spent building Thornvale, fueled by fury and heartbreak. She thought of the way the anger had kept her moving when grief would have stopped her cold. And she thought of the way it burned, always burned. Even when she tried to sleep, even when she tried to be happy, even when the kingdom she built should have been enough. "I do not know yet," she said honestly, "but I know that holding on to it is killing me the same way your guilt is killing you. And I am tired of being destroyed by something you did 3 months ago." She reached out and took his hand. The bond between them flared, bright and warm and aching, and she felt it reach across the damage and the distance and the months of grief and begin to rebuild itself. Not complete, not healed, but reaching. "You will spend the rest of your life earning this back," she said, holding his gaze. "You understand that." "Yes," Aldrich said without hesitation, "and I will not be gentle about it." Something shifted in his face, something like hope, fragile and tentative and terrified of itself. "I would not expect you to be." Airlie squeezed his hand and the bond hummed between them, incomplete and imperfect and alive. The trial took place on the first night of the new moon, in the great hall of Thornvale, before 5,000 wolves. Aldrich came willingly. He surrendered himself at the eastern gate and accepted the silver chains without resistance. And when Thesson read the charges, his voice ringing through the torchlit hall, Aldrich pleaded guilty to everyone. Airlie stood before him and felt the weight of 5,000 lives waiting for her judgment. The crowd wanted punishment. They wanted the Alpha who had humiliated their queen, brought low and broken. But Airlie's had been broken once, and she knew what it cost. She knew that vengeance and justice were not the same thing, and that the woman who had risen from exile would not be the woman who destroyed someone else in return. "You are guilty," she told him, and her voice carried to every corner of the hall. "But your sentence is not death. Your sentence is accountability. You will answer for what was done, not just by you, but by the men who manipulated you and the system that made it possible. And you will spend the rest of your life proving that you are worthy of the bond you once rejected." The elders who had conspired to suppress Airlise were stripped of their positions and exiled that same night. Fenella's family lost their holdings and their influence. Fenella herself left Greymark quietly the following morning and was not seen again. The remaining pack members were given a choice: stay under new leadership aligned with the Moon Court or leave. Most stayed. Aldrich stepped down as alpha voluntarily, handing authority to a council jointly overseen by Thesson and the few Greymark leaders who had played no part in the conspiracy. He moved to Thornvale not as a ruler, not as an alpha, but as a wolf who had broken something sacred and was trying to rebuild it one day at a time. It was not easy. The bond between them grew stronger, but trust was slower. Some mornings Airlise woke beside him and felt nothing but warmth. Other mornings she woke with the phantom ache of the humiliation still echoing behind her ribs, and on those mornings she told him. And he listened without defending himself, and then he went and chopped firewood or trained with Thesson's fighters until his body hurt as much as her heart did. He never once asked her to move faster. He never once implied she owed him forgiveness on any timeline but her own. Months passed. The territory thrived. Thornvale grew into something that was not quite a pack and not quite a kingdom, but something new entirely. A court, open to any wolf regardless of rank or bloodline or birth, governed by a silver-furred wolf who healed the land simply by walking through it. On a quiet evening in late autumn, Airlie stood on the ridge where she had first seen the valley. Aldrich stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Below them, the lights of Thornvale flickered like earthbound stars, and the sound of laughter drifted up through the cold air. "You built all of this," Aldrich said softly. "We are still building," Airlise replied. He turned to look at her, and his eyes held nothing but her reflection. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. And standing on the ridge in the moonlight, overlooking the kingdom that had risen from the ashes of her exile, Airlise felt the last jagged edge of the old wound smooth itself into something bearable. Not gone, never gone entirely, but carried now instead of dragged and lighter every day. The moon hung full and silver above them both, and the valley glowed.